The blood-red sunrise painted the eastern horizon as Beatrice Calloway clutched her small valise, standing alone on the rough-hewn platform of Cottonwood Station. The spring of 1875 had arrived with unseasonable heat, and even at this early hour, perspiration beaded along her hairline beneath her modest bonnet. The station master had barely acknowledged her presence when she'd arrived 15 minutes earlier, merely grunting and pointing toward the empty platform before returning to his newspaper. Beatrice checked her pocket watch for the third time. The stagecoach to Denver was scheduled to depart at 6 o'clock sharp, and that moment was fast approaching. Her entire future depended on making this journey. The teaching position awaiting her represented everything she'd worked for: independence, respectability, and escape from the suffocating confines of her past. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew her attention away from her watch. Shielding her eyes against the rising sun, she spotted a lone rider approaching from the north, moving at a gallop that sent dust clouds billowing behind him. As he drew closer, she could make out his broad-shouldered silhouette, the distinctive shape of a Stetson hat, and the glint of morning light on what appeared to be a sheriff's badge. The rider pulled his chestnut stallion to an abrupt halt beside the platform, his expression grim beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Beatrice recognized him instantly as Marshal Mason Blackwood, the lawman who'd taken over as sheriff of Cottonwood Springs just 6 months prior. His reputation for unbending justice had preceded him, but this was the closest she'd been to the man since his arrival in town. "Miss Calloway," he said, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "You're not going." Beatrice stiffened, her grip tightening on her valise. "I beg your pardon." Marshal Blackwood swung down from his horse, the spurs on his boots jingling as his feet hit the ground. He was taller than she'd realized, standing nearly a head above her, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "The stagecoach isn't coming," he explained, removing his hat to reveal dark hair damp with sweat. "There was an attack 15 miles north. Bandits. 3 passengers dead, driver wounded." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "Dead," she whispered. "I just rode in from the scene." "That stage won't be making the run to Denver today or any day soon." His expression softened slightly as he noticed her distress. "I'm sorry, Miss Calloway. I know you were counting on this journey." "You don't understand," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. "I must reach Denver by the week's end." "The Academy, no stage is leaving Cottonwood Springs today," he interrupted firmly. "It's not safe." "Then I shall find another way," Beatrice declared, lifting her chin defiantly. "Perhaps I could hire a private conveyance or Miss Calloway." The marshal's tone brooked no argument. "Those bandits are still out there. The Farley Gang has been terrorizing the territory for months. They're ruthless and they're watching the roads. No one is traveling north until we've dealt with them." "But my position won't matter if you're dead," he finished bluntly. The station master emerged from his office, a telegram in his weathered hand. "Just got word, Marshal. Army patrol found 2 more bodies about 5 miles from the attack site. Looks like some of the passengers tried to escape on foot." Beatrice swayed slightly, and Marshal Blackwood's hand shot out to steady her elbow. "Easy there," he murmured. "What am I to do?" she asked, more to herself than to him. The teaching position at Denver Ladies' Academy had been her salvation after her father's death left her nearly destitute. The small inheritance he'd left barely covered his debts, and the boarding house where she'd been staying had made it clear her credit would extend no further than the end of the month. "For now, you're returning to town," Marshal Blackwood said, his hand still at her elbow. "I'll escort you back." "I have nowhere to go," Beatrice admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. I've given up my room at Mrs. Halloway's boarding house. Something flickered in the marshal's eyes, concern, perhaps, or calculation. My sister runs a small hotel on Main Street. She often needs help with the bookkeeping. I'm sure she could offer you a room in exchange for some assistance until the roads are safe again. Beatrice wanted to refuse, to insist on finding her own solution, but practicality won out over pride. That's very kind of you, Marshal. Mason, he corrected, offering a faint smile that transformed his stern features. If you're going to be staying in Cottonwood Springs a while longer, you might as well use my given name. The ride back to town was uncomfortable, not just because Beatrice was perched awkwardly in front of Mason on his horse, but because her mind was racing with worries about her future. The letter from the academy had been clear: if she was not in Denver by Monday next to begin the term, they would offer the position to another candidate. "You're very quiet," Mason observed as they approached the outskirts of town. "I'm contemplating the rapid unraveling of all my carefully laid plans," Beatrice replied, unable to keep the bitter edge from her voice. "Plans change," he said simply. "Sometimes for the better." She twisted slightly to look at him. "Is that what happened to you, Marshal? Did your plans change when you came to Cottonwood Springs?" A shadow passed over his face. "You could say that." Before she could inquire further, they arrived at a neat two-story building with a freshly painted sign proclaiming it the Silver Creek Hotel. Mason dismounted first, then reached up to help Beatrice down. His hands were strong at her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. "Melanie," he called as they entered the hotel's small but tidy lobby. "Got someone here who needs a room." A woman with the same storm-gray eyes as Mason emerged from a back office, wiping her hands on an apron. She was younger than Beatrice had expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with a friendly face and dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Melanie, this is Miss Beatrice Calloway." She was meant to leave on this morning's stage to Denver. Understanding dawned in Melanie's eyes. "The stage that was attacked. Oh, you poor dear. How fortunate you weren't aboard." "Miss Calloway needs a place to stay until the roads are safe again," Mason continued. "I mentioned you might have use for someone with bookkeeping skills." Melanie's eyes lit up. "Indeed I do. My ledgers are in a terrible state, and with the mining convention coming next month, I simply haven't had time to sort them properly." She turned to Beatrice with a warm smile. "Do you truly have experience with accounts, Miss Calloway?" "I managed my father's business correspondence and accounts for several years before his passing," Beatrice confirmed. "And please call me Beatrice." "Well, Beatrice, it seems Providence has sent you to us." The room at the end of the hall upstairs is vacant and has a lovely view of the mountains. It's yours, along with meals, in exchange for helping me bring order to my chaotic books. Relief washed over Beatrice. "Thank you, Miss," Melanie corrected with a laugh. "Miss Blackwood." "But Melanie will do just fine." "I need to get back to the office," Mason said, settling his hat back on his head. "Wire the territorial marshal about this latest attack and organize a search party. Will you join us for supper?" Melanie asked her brother. "If I can," he replied, his gaze briefly meeting Beatrice's before he turned to leave. "Welcome to Cottonwood Springs, Miss Calloway. Perhaps a temporary stay here won't be as disappointing as you fear." With that enigmatic statement, he was gone, leaving Beatrice to wonder what fate had in store for her in this dusty frontier town. The room Melanie provided was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a handmade quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a writing desk positioned beneath the window. True to Melanie's word, the view of the distant mountains was breathtaking, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring warmth. After washing away the dust of the morning, Beatrice changed into a simple blue dress and made her way downstairs to begin work on the hotel's accounts. Melanie had not exaggerated the state of disarray. Receipts were stuffed into drawers. Entries in the ledger book skipped weeks at a time, and there appeared to be no system whatsoever for tracking which guests had paid and which still owed money. "This might take longer than a few days," Beatrice murmured as she sorted papers into neat piles. "I warned you it was bad," Melanie said cheerfully, bringing a tray with tea and sandwiches. "Mason's always telling me I need to be more organized, but running this place alone doesn't leave much time for paperwork." "How long have you owned the hotel?" Beatrice asked, accepting a cup of tea gratefully. 3 years. It was in terrible condition when I bought it. The previous owner let it fall to ruin after his wife died." Melanie sat down across from Beatrice. "Mason helped me renovate when he could get away from his duties in Kansas City." "He wasn't always the marshal here then." Melanie's expression grew somber. "No. He was a federal marshal in Kansas City until last fall. There was an incident. He needed a change." Beatrice sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. "Well, his loss is Cottonwood Springs' gain, I suppose." "And yours," Melanie said with a knowing smile. "If not for Mason, you might have been on that stagecoach." The thought sent a chill through Beatrice. "Yes, I suppose that's true. He's a good man, my brother, the best I know. Tough as rawhide on the outside, but he's got a heart in there somewhere." Melanie stood, gathering the empty teacups. "I should let you get back to work. Supper's at 6, whether Mason makes it or not." Beatrice spent the remainder of the afternoon immersed in the hotel's accounts, gradually bringing order to the chaos. By the time Melanie called her for supper, she had created a comprehensive system for tracking guests and payments, and had reconciled the ledgers for the past month. To her surprise, Mason arrived just as they were sitting down to eat, bringing with him the scent of horses and gunpowder. He'd clearly been riding hard, his face lined with fatigue. "Any news of the bandits?" Melanie asked as she served him a generous portion of beef stew. "Tracks headed east into the Badlands," he replied, nodding his thanks. "Army's sending a detachment from Fort Collins, but it could be days before they arrive. Until then, we're on our own." "How many men do you have?" Beatrice asked. Mason glanced at her, seeming to appreciate her practical question. "2 deputies, plus whatever volunteers I can muster from town." "Not enough to go after the Farley Gang directly." "I've heard stories about them," Melanie said with a shudder. "They say the leader, Wade Farley, killed his own brother over a card game." "They're vicious, no doubt about it," Mason agreed. "Been terrorizing the territory for the better part of a year. Started with small robberies, but they've grown bolder. This is the first time they've attacked a stagecoach in this county, though." "Could they have been after something specific?" Beatrice asked, her mind working through the possibilities. "Or someone?" Mason's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "What makes you ask that? It seems an escalation, as you said. Perhaps there was a reason for it." "The Army payroll was due through on tomorrow's stage, not today's," Mason mused. "But you might be onto something, Miss Calloway. I'll wire the stage company in the morning, see if there was anything unusual about today's run." After supper, Mason excused himself to make one final patrol of the town before turning in for the night. Beatrice helped Melanie clear the dishes, then returned to her room, too restless for sleep, despite the emotional exhaustion of the day. She sat at the small desk and penned a letter to the headmistress of Denver Ladies' Academy, explaining her situation and begging for a short extension. Perhaps if she could reach Denver within the week, the position might still be hers. She had to try. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Mason standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. "Melanie mentioned you were still awake." I thought you might want to know that a trader arrived in town this evening. He's heading to Denver day after tomorrow with a wagon train. If the roads are clear by then, you could travel with them." Hope surged in Beatrice's chest. "That would be wonderful. Thank you for telling me. It's not as comfortable as the stage, and it'll take longer, but it's safer than traveling alone." He hesitated, then added, "Though I still think you'd be better off waiting until we've dealt with the Farley Gang. I appreciate your concern, Marshal, but this position is too important to me. I can't afford to lose it." He studied her face for a long moment. "What's waiting for you in Denver that's worth risking your life?" "Independence," she answered honestly. "A future of my own making." Something like understanding flickered in his eyes. "I respect that, just be careful with your choices, Miss Calloway." "I always am," she replied. "Good night, Marshal." "Mason," he reminded her with the ghost of a smile. "Good night, Beatrice." After he left, Beatrice found herself staring at the door, puzzled by the strange flutter in her stomach when he'd said her name. She dismissed it as hunger or fatigue and returned to her letter, but sleep proved elusive that night. Her dreams filled with bandits and blood-red sunrises and a pair of storm-gray eyes. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Beatrice rose early and continued her work on the hotel's accounts, making significant progress before breakfast. She was just closing the ledger when Melanie burst into the office, her face pale. "There's been another attack," she said breathlessly. "A freight wagon about 10 miles south of town. Mason just rode out with his deputies." Beatrice's heart sank. "The Farley Gang again. That's what folks are saying. They killed the driver and stole everything." Melanie wrung her hands. "This is getting worse, Beatrice. They've never been so active in one area before." "What about the wagon train to Denver?" Beatrice asked, thinking of her precarious plans. "I don't know. I expect they'll delay departure now with bandits striking so close to town." Melanie sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Beatrice. I know how important getting to Denver is to you." Beatrice forced a smile. "It's not your fault. Besides, I'm enjoying the work here. Your accounts are quite fascinating." Melanie laughed despite her worry. "Only you would find my disastrous bookkeeping fascinating. Come, let's have breakfast. No sense facing trouble on an empty stomach." The day passed slowly, tension hanging over the town like a thundercloud. More reports filtered in throughout the afternoon. Another farm raided south of town, cattle stolen from a ranch to the east. By sunset, it was clear that the Farley Gang had the entire county under siege. Mason didn't return until well after dark. Beatrice and Melanie were sitting in the hotel's small parlor when he trudged in, looking as though he'd aged years in a single day. "The wagon train's canceled," he announced without preamble. "No one's leaving Cottonwood Springs until this situation is resolved." "How long will that be?" Beatrice asked, rising to her feet. "I don't know," he admitted, collapsing into an armchair. "The army detachment is delayed. Apparently there's trouble with the Cheyenne up north drawing away their forces. So we're on our own," Melanie concluded. "Not entirely. I've sent for help from neighboring towns, but it could be days before anyone arrives." Mason ran a hand over his face. "In the meantime, I've instituted a curfew. No one on the streets after sundown, and no one leaves town without an armed escort." "What about my journey to Denver?" Beatrice asked, though she already knew the answer. Mason's expression was gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Beatrice. It's simply too dangerous right now." Disappointment crashed over her, but she nodded acceptance. "I understand." "I'm organizing a town meeting tomorrow at noon," Mason continued. "We need to form a citizens' militia, set up patrols. The Farley Gang has never been this bold before. Something's driving them to take these risks, and I aim to find out what it is." Melanie brought her brother a plate of food and a cup of coffee. "Eat something before you fall over, Mason. You're no good to anyone exhausted and starving." He accepted the food gratefully. "You're a saint, Mel." "Hardly," she snorted. "Just a practical woman who knows her stubborn brother too well." As Mason ate, Beatrice excused herself to return to her room. She needed to write another letter to the academy, explaining the deteriorating situation. Perhaps they would understand the circumstances and hold the position a little longer. She was halfway up the stairs when Mason called her name. Turning, she found him at the bottom of the staircase, looking up at her with an unreadable expression. "I truly am sorry about Denver," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to have plans derailed." "Life rarely follows the course we set for it," she replied with a small shrug. "My father used to say that the measure of a person is how they navigate the unexpected bends in the river." "Wise man, your father." "He was," she agreed, a familiar ache of loss squeezing her heart. "Good night, Mason." "Good night, Beatrice. Sleep well." But sleep proved elusive for the second night in a row. Beatrice lay awake, listening to the occasional sounds from the street below, the heavy tread of the night watchman, the distant whinny of horses, the soft hooting of an owl. Her mind kept returning to the crushing disappointment of her thwarted plans, and to the inexplicable warmth she felt whenever Mason looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "This is foolishness," she muttered to herself, punching her pillow into a more comfortable shape. "You've known the man 2 days, and you're leaving as soon as possible." Yet as she finally drifted toward sleep, it was Mason's face that followed her into her dreams. The town meeting the next day was held in the church, the only building in Cottonwood Springs large enough to accommodate the entire population. Beatrice sat with Melanie near the front, watching as Mason addressed the anxious crowd. "The Farley Gang is operating with a purpose," he explained, his voice steady and authoritative. "They're not just raiding randomly, they're cutting off all routes in and out of Cottonwood Springs." Murmurs rippled through the assembled townspeople. "Why?" someone called out. "What do they want with our town?" "That's what we need to find out," Mason replied. "In the meantime, we need to prepare. I'm asking for volunteers to form a militia. Every able-bodied man who can handle a rifle. We'll establish patrols, secure the town perimeter." Men began standing, offering their services. Beatrice watched as Mason organized them into groups, assigning responsibilities with the efficiency of someone who had led men before. "What about us women?" a voice called from the back. It was Margaret Wheeler, the blacksmith's wife, a formidable woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper aim with a shotgun. "Some of us can shoot better than our husbands." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd, but Mason nodded seriously. "Anyone who can handle a weapon and is willing to defend this town is welcome, Mrs. Wheeler. We need all the help we can get." The meeting continued, with plans made for fortifying the town and rationing supplies in case of a prolonged siege. Throughout it all, Beatrice was struck by Mason's calm leadership. He didn't sugarcoat the danger, but neither did he allow panic to take hold. As the meeting broke up, Mason approached Beatrice and Melanie. "The hotel could be a target," he said without preamble. "It's the largest building in town apart from the saloon. If the Farley Gang does make a move on Cottonwood Springs, they might try to use it as a stronghold." "What are you suggesting?" Melanie asked, her face paling. "Move your guests to other accommodations if possible. And be prepared to evacuate quickly if necessary." His gaze shifted to Beatrice. "Can you shoot?" The question surprised her. Yes, actually. My father taught me. We lived in a remote area for several years during my childhood." "Good." He handed her a small revolver from his belt. "Keep this with you. I hope you won't need it, but just in case." Beatrice accepted the weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Beatrice felt that same inexplicable flutter in her stomach. Judging by the slight widening of Mason's eyes, he'd felt something too. The moment was broken when one of Mason's deputies burst into the church, breathing hard. "Marshal, riders approaching from the east, 6 of them, moving fast." Mason's expression hardened. "Everyone stay here," he commanded, then turned to his deputy. "Get the men we just assigned to the East Watch, armed and ready in 5 minutes." Beatrice watched him stride away, the revolver still warm in her hand. She turned to Melanie, who looked as frightened as Beatrice felt. "He'll handle it," Melanie said, though her voice trembled slightly. "He always does." Beatrice squeezed her new friend's hand. "Of course he will." But as the minutes ticked by with no word from outside, anxiety began to build in the church. Children whimpered, sensing the tension of their parents. Men paced, while women huddled together, speaking in hushed voices. Finally, after what seemed an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, the church door opened. Mason entered, followed by a trail-worn man in the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. "It's all right," Mason announced to the waiting crowd. "These aren't bandits. This is Marshal Frank Hollister from the Denver office along with his deputies. They've come to help us with the Farley Gang." Relief swept through the room like a cool breeze. Beatrice found herself exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Marshal Hollister and his men have been tracking the Farley Gang for months," Mason continued. "They have information that might explain why the gang has focused their attention on Cottonwood Springs." The Denver marshal stepped forward. He was older than Mason, with graying hair and a weathered face that had seen its share of troubles. "Folks, we have reason to believe the Farley Gang is after something specific in your town, or someone." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Wade Farley was seen in Denver 2 weeks ago, asking questions about a stagecoach run to Cottonwood Springs. We believe he was looking for information about a passenger." Marshal Hollister's gaze swept the assembly. "Is there anyone here who recently arrived by stage, or was planning to leave on one?" Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face as every head in the church turned toward her. Mason's eyes locked with hers, a mixture of confusion and concern in their gray depths. "Miss Calloway was set to leave on the stage that was attacked," Mason said slowly. "But she wasn't on it because I stopped her from boarding." Marshal Hollister approached Beatrice, his expression grave. "Madam, have you ever encountered Wade Farley or any of his gang before?" "No, never," Beatrice replied, bewildered. "I've only been in this territory for 6 months and I've rarely left Cottonwood Springs during that time." "Are you carrying anything valuable, something that might attract attention?" "Nothing," she insisted. "Just my personal belongings. I was traveling to Denver to take a teaching position." Marshal Hollister frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answers. "Is there anything unusual about your background? Any connection to mining, banking, or government work?" "My father was a professor of literature at a small college in Pennsylvania," Beatrice said. "After he died, I came west seeking employment. There's nothing remotely interesting about me that would attract the attention of bandits." "Well, something has the Farley Gang mighty interested in either you or that stagecoach," Hollister said grimly. "And until we figure out what it is, you're in danger, Miss Calloway." Mason stepped forward. "She'll stay at the hotel under my protection, Frank. No one will get to her there." "Your choice, Blackwood, but remember who we're dealing with," Hollister cautioned. "Wade Farley doesn't give up easily when he wants something." The meeting dispersed shortly after, with the Denver lawmen heading to the sheriff's office to coordinate their efforts with Mason's deputies. Beatrice walked back to the hotel with Melanie, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes suspicious glances from the townspeople they passed. "They think I'm somehow responsible for bringing this trouble to town," Beatrice said quietly as they entered the hotel lobby. "Nonsense," Melanie replied firmly. "You're as much a victim in this as anyone. Besides, Mason won't let anything happen to you. Why would he put himself at risk for someone he barely knows?" Melanie gave her a knowing look. "My brother doesn't do anything halfway, Beatrice. If he's decided to protect you, then protect you he will no matter the cost." The thought was both comforting and troubling. Beatrice had no wish to be the cause of harm coming to Mason or anyone else in Cottonwood Springs. That evening, Mason returned to the hotel with Marshal Hollister and 2 of his deputies. They set up a guard rotation, with one man always stationed in the lobby and another patrolling the perimeter of the building. "Is all this really necessary?" Beatrice asked when Mason informed her of the arrangements. "I'm not taking any chances," he replied, his jaw set in a determined line. "The Farley Gang has killed 12 people in the last 6 months. Whatever they want with you, they're not getting it." "But that's just it," she said, frustration coloring her voice. "I have no idea what they could possibly want with me. I'm a school teacher, Mason. I don't have money or jewels or secrets." "Everyone has secrets," Marshal Hollister commented from his position by the window. "Sometimes we just don't recognize them as such." Beatrice's mind raced, searching for anything in her past that could have attracted the attention of outlaws. There was nothing, just the quiet, respectable life of a professor's daughter, followed by the struggle to support herself after his death. "Perhaps it's a case of mistaken identity," she suggested. "They could be looking for someone else who was supposed to be on that stage." "That's possible," Mason agreed. "I've wired the stage company for a complete passenger manifest. Should have an answer by tomorrow." As night fell, the hotel grew quiet. The few remaining guests had been moved to rooms on the ground floor near the lobby, where they could be better protected. Beatrice found herself alone in her room, the small revolver Mason had given her placed on the nightstand within easy reach. Sleep eluded her once again, her mind too full of questions and fears. Around midnight she gave up trying and lit a lamp, reaching for the book she'd been reading before her life had been so thoroughly disrupted. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Who is it?" She called, her hand moving instinctively toward the revolver. "It's Mason," came the quiet reply. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, looking exhausted but alert. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, everything's quiet. I saw the light under your door and thought you might like some company. If it's not inappropriate," he added hastily. Beatrice hesitated, aware of the impropriety of allowing a man into her room at this hour. Yet the thought of sitting alone with her troubled thoughts was even less appealing. "You may come in," she decided, leaving the door partly open as a concession to propriety. "Though I can't imagine why you'd want to spend your free time with the person who's caused all this trouble." "You haven't caused anything," Mason said firmly, taking the chair by the window while Beatrice perched on the edge of the bed. "And I thought you might have questions that are easier to ask without an audience." She studied him in the lamplight, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. Despite his exhaustion, there was something undeniably compelling about Mason Blackwood, a quiet strength that drew her to him. "Why did you really come to Cottonwood Springs?" she asked suddenly. Melanie mentioned there was an incident in Kansas City. Mason's expression shuddered briefly before he sighed. "I shot a man, a fellow marshal who had been taking bribes from outlaws, helping them escape justice. When I confronted him, he drew on me." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I was faster." "You had no choice," Beatrice said softly. "That's what the inquiry found. But his family, his friends, they saw it differently, called me a murderer." He looked down at his hands. After that, I couldn't stay in Kansas City. Melanie suggested I come here, take over as marshal when old Sheriff Collins retired. I'm sorry, Beatrice murmured, understanding now the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. Don't be. It worked out for the best. His gaze lifted to meet hers. Your turn. What really awaits you in Denver? Is it just the teaching position, or are you running from something too? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. I'm not running, she said after a moment. I'm seeking independence, as I told you before, the chance to build a life on my own terms. And there's nothing for you here in Cottonwood Springs. The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice found herself unable to look away from his intense gaze. I've only been here 6 months, she said finally. And most of that time I was working as a seamstress for Mrs. Parker, counting the days until I could leave for somewhere with more opportunities. And now I don't know, she admitted. Everything has changed so quickly. Mason nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. We'll figure out why the Farley Gang is after you, Beatrice. I promise you that. And then you'll be free to go to Denver if that's still what you want. Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or resignation. Before Beatrice could respond, shouts erupted from outside, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Mason was on his feet instantly, drawing his pistol. Stay here, he ordered, all trace of the contemplative man gone, replaced by the hard-eyed lawman. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me or Melanie. He was gone before she could protest, the door closing firmly behind him. Beatrice moved to lock it as instructed, then stood frozen, listening to the sounds of conflict escalating outside. More gunshots rang out, closer now, followed by the crash of breaking glass downstairs. Against her better judgment, Beatrice grabbed the revolver from the nightstand and moved to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. The street below was chaos. Men on horseback, at least a dozen, were exchanging fire with Mason's deputies and the Denver marshals. As she watched, one of the riders broke away from the group and headed directly for the hotel's front entrance. Beatrice's blood ran cold. The Farley Gang had come for her, just as Mason had feared. And now people were dying because of it. A pounding at her door made her jump. Beatrice! It was Melanie, her voice high with fear. Let me in, quickly. Beatrice unlocked the door and Melanie rushed inside, her face pale and her hair disheveled. They've breached the lobby, she gasped. We need to go now. There's a back staircase that leads to the alley. Where's Mason? Beatrice demanded, clutching the revolver tightly, fighting them off downstairs with Marshal Hollister. He sent me to get you out. Melanie grabbed a shawl from the hook by the door and thrust it at Beatrice. Hurry! Beatrice had no time to gather her belongings. She followed Melanie into the hallway and toward a narrow door at the far end that she hadn't noticed before. It opened onto a steep, dark staircase that indeed led down to the rear of the building. They had just reached the bottom when the door to the alley burst open, revealing a burly man with a scar bisecting his left cheek. He grinned when he saw them, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Well, what have we here? He drawled, blocking their escape. You must be the schoolteacher Wade's been so keen on finding. Melanie moved in front of Beatrice protectively. Leave her alone, the man laughed, reaching for Melanie with a meaty hand. Ain't you a spirited little? His words cut off abruptly as Beatrice raised the revolver and fired. The shot wasn't perfect. It hit him in the shoulder rather than center mass, but it was enough to send him stumbling backward with a howl of pain. Run! Beatrice shouted, pulling Melanie past the wounded outlaw and into the dark alley beyond. They fled through the maze of back streets, the sounds of gunfire growing fainter behind them. Beatrice had no idea where they were going, but Melanie seemed to have a destination in mind, leading them unerringly through the darkness. They eventually emerged at a small house on the outskirts of town. Melanie rapped softly on the back door, which opened almost immediately to reveal Margaret Wheeler, the blacksmith's wife, holding a shotgun at the ready. "Thank God," Margaret whispered, ushering them inside and quickly bolting the door behind them. "When the shooting started, I feared the worst." "The Farley Gang attacked the hotel," Melanie explained breathlessly. "They're after Beatrice." Margaret's shrewd eyes assessed Beatrice. "Any idea why, girl?" "None whatsoever," Beatrice replied honestly. "Well, you'll be safe enough here for now. My husband's gone to help with the defense of the town, but he left me well equipped." She patted the shotgun affectionately. "Anyone tries to break in here, they'll get a face full of buckshot for their trouble." For the next hour they waited in tense silence, listening for any approach. Eventually, the distant sounds of conflict faded to an eerie quiet. "You think it's over?" Melanie whispered. "Or just beginning," Margaret replied grimly. "Wade Farley doesn't give up easily from what I've heard." A soft knock at the door made them all start. Margaret raised her shotgun, motioning for Beatrice and Melanie to move behind her. "Who is it?" she called. "Mason Blackwood," came the reply, his voice instantly recognizable to Beatrice. "I've got Marshal Hollister with me. We're looking for my sister and Miss Calloway." Margaret opened the door cautiously, shotgun still at the ready, but lowered it when she confirmed it was indeed Mason and the Denver marshal. Both men were disheveled and dirty, with Mason sporting a bloody gash across his forehead. "Mason," Melanie cried, rushing to her brother. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said dismissively, though he winced when she touched near the wound. His eyes sought Beatrice, relief washing over his face when he found her unharmed. "You're all right." "Yes," she assured him. "Thanks to Melanie and this." She held up the revolver he'd given her. "I had to use it." His eyebrows rose. "Did you hit what you aimed at?" "Yes, though not where I intended. I wounded one of them in the shoulder when he tried to grab Melanie." Mason's lips quirked in a hint of a smile. "Remind me not to underestimate you, Beatrice Calloway." Marshal Hollister cleared his throat. "The Farley Gangs retreated for now, but they'll be back. They lost 3 men in the attack, including Wade's younger brother Elias." "Did you capture any of them?" Beatrice asked. 2, Mason confirmed. "They're locked up at the jail." Unfortunately, Wade Farley himself escaped. "What did they want?" Melanie asked. Was it really Beatrice they were after? Mason and Hollister exchanged a look. "Yes," Mason said finally. "They were specifically looking for you, Beatrice, but we still don't know why." "I'd like to speak with the prisoners," Beatrice said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Perhaps I'll recognize them or they'll recognize me." "That's too dangerous," Mason objected immediately. "It might be our best lead," Marshal Hollister countered. "If Miss Calloway is willing, it could save us a lot of time." Mason clearly didn't like the idea, but he nodded reluctantly. "First light, then, and she'll be behind bars the entire time with both of us present." "Agreed," Hollister said. The night passed slowly. Margaret insisted they all stay at her house, declaring it safer than returning to the damaged hotel. Mason and Hollister took turns keeping watch, while Melanie eventually dozed off in a chair by the fire. Beatrice, however, remained wide awake, her mind racing with questions. Why would notorious outlaws target a schoolteacher with no money and no connections? What could they possibly want from her? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that it must be a case of mistaken identity. Yet that raised the troubling question of who they thought she was, and whether that person was in genuine danger. As dawn approached, Mason found her sitting by the window, staring out at the gradually lightening sky. "You should try to sleep," he said softly, careful not to wake the others. I'm not sure I remember how, she replied with a faint smile. Too much has happened. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, but not so close as to be improper. Are you sure about this? Facing the prisoners, I mean. I need answers, Mason. We all do. She turned to look at him, noting the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. You should be the one resting. You've been fighting all night. I'll rest when this is over. His gaze was intense, searching her face as if memorizing every detail. When you're safe. Something in his tone made her heart flutter. Why do you care so much? About my safety, I mean. For a long moment he was silent, and Beatrice thought he might not answer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said. Because from the moment I saw you standing on that platform at sunrise, something changed. I can't explain it. I just know that keeping you safe matters more than anything has in a very long time. The simple honesty of his words stole Beatrice's breath. Before she could formulate a response, Marshal Hollister stirred from his position by the door, announcing that it was time to head to the jail. The walk through town was sobering. Several buildings showed signs of damage from the previous night's attack: broken windows, bullet holes in walls, a wagon overturned in the street. The townspeople were already out, assessing the damage and beginning repairs. They nodded respectfully to Mason and Hollister, but regarded Beatrice with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The jail was a small, sturdy building of stone and timber, one of the few structures in town built to withstand serious assault. Inside, Mason's 2 deputies were on alert, rifles at the ready. In the cells at the back sat 2 men, one middle-aged with a grizzled beard, the other barely more than a boy, perhaps 19 or 20. These are the only 2 we managed to capture, Mason explained as they approached the cells. The older one is Ben Tucker, a known associate of the Farley Gang for several years. The younger one calls himself Jimmy Wells, but we're not sure if that's his real name. Beatrice studied the prisoners carefully. The older man, Tucker, glared at her with undisguised hatred. The younger one, Wells, looked frightened, his eyes darting nervously between her and the lawman. I've never seen either of these men before, Beatrice said with certainty. But they've seen you, Marshal Hollister remarked. Or at least they think they have. Tucker, why don't you tell Miss Calloway why the Farley Gang is so interested in her? Tucker spat on the floor. Ain't saying nothing. Your boss left you behind, Hollister reminded him. Wade Farley rode off and didn't look back, even though you've ridden with him for years. Loyalty only goes one way with Wade. A flicker of doubt crossed Tucker's weathered face, but he remained silent. Mason turned his attention to the younger prisoner. What about you, Wells? You want to spend the next 20 years in prison for a man who abandoned you. Wells licked his lips nervously. I didn't kill nobody, he said, his voice cracking. I just joined up with them a month ago, needed the money. So tell us what you know, Mason pressed. Why is Wade Farley after Miss Calloway? Wells glanced at Tucker, who glared at him warningly. After a moment of visible indecision, the young man's shoulders slumped. It ain't her exactly, he said quietly. It's what she's carrying. Beatrice frowned in confusion. Carrying? I'm not carrying anything of value. The papers, Wells clarified. Wade said you had papers that belonged to him, said they were worth more than gold. What papers? Mason demanded. I don't know exactly. Wade didn't tell us everything. Just said they proved something important, something that could make him rich. Wells looked pleadingly at Beatrice. He said you stole them from his partner 6 months ago in Denver. That's impossible, Beatrice protested. I wasn't in Denver 6 months ago. I was here in Cottonwood Springs working for Mrs. Parker. You're lying, Tucker suddenly shouted. Wade showed us your picture. Said you worked for that lawyer in Denver, the one who got killed. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "Lawyer? What lawyer, Hamilton?" Tucker growled. "Edgar Hamilton. Wade's partner killed him when he wouldn't hand over the deed." "Deed to what?" Marshal Hollister interjected. "The Silver Queen mine," Wells supplied. "Wade said it's worth a fortune, but the deed went missing after Hamilton was killed. He figured his secretary, he nodded at Beatrice, took it and ran." Beatrice shook her head firmly. "I've never worked for anyone named Edgar Hamilton. I've never even been to Denver." "Then why does Wade have a photograph of you standing next to Hamilton?" Tucker challenged. "I don't know," Beatrice replied honestly, "but it can't be me." Mason and Hollister exchanged a significant look. "A twin, perhaps," Hollister suggested. "Or a very close resemblance." "I don't have a twin," Beatrice said. "At least, not that I know of." "Show us this photograph," Mason demanded of Tucker. The outlaw sneered. "Don't have it. Wade keeps it on him." Mason turned to Beatrice, his expression troubled. "Is there any possibility, any at all, that you could have a twin or a sister you don't know about?" Beatrice's mind raced through the possibilities. Her mother had died when she was very young, and her father had never remarried or spoken of other children. But there had always been a certain reticence about her father when it came to discussing her mother or their early life together. "I suppose it's not impossible," she admitted slowly. "My father never spoke much about my mother or her family. They were estranged," he said. "We need to send a wire to Denver," Hollister decided. "Get more information about this Edgar Hamilton and his secretary." "Agreed," Mason said. "And in the meantime, Beatrice stays under guard. If the Farley Gang thinks she has this deed, they won't stop coming after her." The wire was sent, but it would be at least a day before they could expect a reply. In the interim, Mason insisted that Beatrice remain at his office, the most secure building in town. Melanie brought fresh clothes and necessities from the hotel, which had suffered significant damage during the attack but remained structurally sound. "The whole town's talking about you," Melanie informed Beatrice as she unpacked the items. "About this possible twin or look-alike in Denver." "What are they saying?" Beatrice asked warily. "Most folks are just curious. Some are speculating that you've been living a double life." Melanie gave her a reassuring smile. "But those who know you don't believe it for a second. You're not the type to secretly work for a lawyer in Denver while simultaneously serving as Mrs. Parker's seamstress here." Beatrice sighed, sinking into a chair in Mason's small office. "None of this makes sense. Why would I have a double? And if I do, why didn't my father ever mention her?" "Maybe he didn't know," Melanie suggested gently. "Or maybe he had his reasons for keeping it secret." Beatrice spent the remainder of the day in a state of restless anxiety, alternating between pacing the confines of Mason's office and sitting lost in thought. Mason himself was busy organizing repairs to the town and strengthening defenses in case of another attack, but he checked on her regularly, his concern evident in the softening of his eyes whenever they met hers. By evening, the town had settled into an uneasy calm. Extra guards were posted at strategic locations, and families had been advised to stay indoors after dark. Mason returned to the office with a tray of food from the hotel's kitchen, which had escaped the worst of the damage. "You should eat something," he said, setting the tray before her. "Melanie says you've barely touched anything all day." "I'm not very hungry," Beatrice admitted, though she accepted the cup of coffee he offered. "My mind is too full of questions." Mason sat across from her, his own exhaustion finally beginning to show in the slump of his shoulders. "We'll have answers soon. The telegraph operator says the lines to Denver are busy but functioning. We should have a reply by morning." "And then what?" Beatrice asked quietly. "If it turns out I do have a double in Denver, what does that mean for me, for my future?" That depends on what we learn, Mason replied carefully. But whatever happens, you won't face it alone. The promise in his words warmed her more than the coffee. Thank you, Mason, for everything. He reached across the desk, hesitating briefly before covering her hand with his own. Get some rest, Beatrice. I've had a cot set up in the back room for you. I'll be right out here all night. Beatrice nodded, suddenly too tired to argue. The events of the past few days had drained her more than she'd realized. She retreated to the small back room, where a narrow cot had indeed been prepared with clean linens and a warm blanket. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was fitful, her dreams a jumbled mess of stagecoaches, bandits, and a woman with her face who called out warnings she couldn't quite hear. She woke before dawn, disoriented and with a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. The main office was quiet when she emerged. Mason was dozing in his chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes. She hesitated, loath to disturb him, but as if sensing her presence, he stirred and straightened. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Any better today?" "Not particularly," she admitted. "I had strange dreams." Before Mason could respond, the door to the office burst open, admitting Marshal Hollister. His expression was a mixture of excitement and concern. "Got a reply from Denver," he announced, waving a telegram. "And it's a doozy." Edgar Hamilton was indeed a lawyer, specializing in mining claims. He was murdered 6 months ago in his office, and his secretary disappeared the same day, along with several important documents. "And the secretary?" Mason prompted, fully alert now. "Her name was Belinda Calloway," Hollister said, his gaze shifting to Beatrice. "According to Denver police, she was never found. They've been looking for her as both a potential witness and a possible suspect in Hamilton's murder." Beatrice felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Belinda Calloway," she repeated faintly. That's impossible." "There's more," Hollister continued grimly. "I asked them to send a description." Belinda Calloway was 26 years old, 5'4", with auburn hair and green eyes. She came to Denver from Pennsylvania about a year ago, claiming to be the daughter of a college professor. The description matched Beatrice exactly right down to her background. "They're sending a photograph by courier," Hollister added. "Should arrive tomorrow. But from the description, it sounds like we're dealing with identical twins." "Or the same person," Mason said quietly, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. "I am not Belinda Calloway," Beatrice declared firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "I have never been to Denver before. I have never worked for a lawyer named Edgar Hamilton. I am Beatrice Calloway, daughter of Professor William Calloway of Whittier College in Pennsylvania." "No one's accusing you of anything," Mason assured her quickly. "But we need to consider all possibilities. Is there any chance you could have a twin sister you don't know about?" Beatrice sank into a chair, her mind racing. "My mother died when I was very young, barely 3 years old." "Consumption," my father said. "He rarely spoke of her, and I have only the vaguest memories. I suppose it's possible that there was a twin, but why would my father never mention it?" "Perhaps to protect you," Hollister suggested. "If this Belinda is involved in a murder and theft, maybe your father knew something about her tendencies and wanted to keep you separate. Or perhaps they were separated at birth," Mason added. "It wasn't uncommon in the past for twins to be split up if a family couldn't support both children." Beatrice shook her head, overwhelmed by the possibilities. "This is all conjecture. We won't know anything for certain until we see this photograph. In the meantime, the Farley Gang is still out there," Hollister reminded them, "and they still think you have the deed to the Silver Queen mine." "Which I most certainly do not," Beatrice said firmly. "But your twin might," Mason pointed out. "If she took documents from Hamilton's office before fleeing, she could have the deed Wade Farley is so desperate to get his hands on." The day passed in tense anticipation. Word had spread through town about the telegram from Denver, and Beatrice found herself the object of even more curious stares and whispers when she ventured out of Mason's office for a brief walk in the afternoon. "Pay them no mind," Mason advised, walking beside her as both protector and companion. "Small towns thrive on gossip, but they'll find something new to talk about soon enough. If I do have a twin who's wanted for murder, I doubt they'll forget that anytime soon," Beatrice replied wryly. They walked in companionable silence for a while, eventually finding themselves at the small church where the town meeting had been held. The building was empty at this hour, and Beatrice found herself drawn inside, seeking the peace and quiet that had been so elusive lately. Mason followed, respectfully removing his hat as they entered the simple sanctuary. Beatrice sat in a pew near the front, and after a moment's hesitation, Mason joined her. "My father was a man of great integrity," Beatrice said softly, breaking the silence. "If I have a twin sister, there must have been a compelling reason for him to keep her existence from me. I cannot believe he would have done so out of malice or deceit. People sometimes make difficult choices for what they believe are the right reasons," Mason replied. "Especially when it comes to protecting those they love. As you did when you left Kansas City," he nodded slowly. "I could have stayed, fought the whispers and accusations, but it would have tainted everything I did there, and ultimately it wasn't worth the cost. You regret it, leaving?" Mason turned to look at her, his gray eyes intent. "Not anymore." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that made Beatrice's heart beat faster. In the hushed quiet of the church, with sunlight streaming through the simple stained glass windows, she felt a connection to Mason Blackwood that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Whatever we learn when that photograph arrives," Mason said quietly, "it won't change who you are, Beatrice. The woman I've come to know in these past few days." "And who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone brave, resourceful, compassionate." His eyes never left hers. "Someone I find myself thinking about far more than is probably wise." Beatrice felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "We've known each other less than a week." "Sometimes a week is enough to recognize something worth holding on to," he replied simply. Before Beatrice could respond, the church door opened, admitting one of Mason's deputies. "Marshal." "Rider coming in fast from the north. Looks like the courier from Denver." The moment between them shattered, reality intruding with all its complications. Mason rose immediately, extending a hand to help Beatrice to her feet. "Let's go find out if you have a twin, shall we?" The courier was a young Army private who had ridden hard from the nearest telegraph station where the photograph had been received. He handed the sealed envelope to Marshal Hollister, who opened it carefully and withdrew a stiff card with a photograph mounted on it. Hollister stared at the image for a long moment, then looked up at Beatrice with an unreadable expression. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, passing the photograph to Mason. Mason's reaction was similar, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a long, evaluating look at Beatrice. Finally, he handed the photograph to her. Beatrice looked down at the image and felt as if she'd been struck. The woman in the photograph could have been her own reflection, the same heart-shaped face, the same eyes, the same auburn hair arranged in a similar style to how Beatrice often wore hers. The only discernible difference was the expression, where Beatrice's countenance typically held warmth and openness. This woman's eyes were cooler, her smile more calculated. "It's not me," Beatrice said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "But the resemblance is uncanny." "She's dressed well," Hollister observed. "That's an expensive dress for a lawyer's secretary." "The note says this was taken at a social function last winter," Mason said, reading the paper that had accompanied the photograph. A fundraiser for the Denver Opera House. Hamilton apparently moved in wealthy circles. I've never owned a dress like that in my life, Beatrice murmured, still staring at the image of her double. My father's salary as a professor was modest, and since his death, I've been living frugally. The Denver police want to know if we've apprehended Belinda Calloway, Hollister said, reading from the telegram that had arrived with the courier. They're sending an officer to identify her and escort her back to Denver if it is indeed her. Isn't, Mason said firmly. Beatrice has been in Cottonwood Springs for 6 months, working as a seamstress for Mrs. Parker. Dozens of people can vouch for her presence here during the time Hamilton was murdered. Hollister nodded, accepting this. Still doesn't solve our problem with the Farley Gang. They clearly believe she's Belinda and that she has the deed they want. Then we need to find the real Belinda, Mason decided. She's the key to all of this. Easier said than done, Hollister replied dryly. Denver police have been looking for her for 6 months with no success. They weren't looking for Beatrice Calloway, Mason pointed out. If Belinda is using her twin's identity, that could explain why she's been so hard to find. Beatrice's mind was still reeling from the revelation that she had a twin sister, a twin who was possibly a thief and murderer. My father never mentioned a sister, she said again, as if repetition might somehow make the reality less shocking. Not once in all the years I was growing up. Do you have any of his papers? Mason asked gently. Letters, journals, anything that might shed light on this mystery. Beatrice nodded slowly. Yes, I have his personal effects. They're in my trunk at the hotel. I couldn't bring myself to go through everything after he died, so I just packed it all and brought it with me when I came west. Then that's where we start, Mason decided. Let's go see if your father left any clues about your sister. Melanie had already begun the process of cleaning and repairing the hotel, but Beatrice's room was largely untouched, the small trunk still sitting at the foot of her bed where it had been since her arrival in Cottonwood Springs. Kneeling before it, Beatrice unlocked the brass clasp and lifted the lid. Inside were the remnants of her former life, a few books, her father's pocket watch, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and at the bottom, a small wooden box she recognized as her father's personal lockbox. He always kept his important papers in here, she explained, lifting the box onto the bed. The key should be. Yes, here it is. She withdrew a small brass key from a hidden pocket in the lining of the trunk. The box opened with a soft click, revealing a stack of neatly organized documents. Beatrice began sifting through them: her father's will, the deed to their small house in Pennsylvania, long since sold to pay his debts, various academic papers he had written. And then, at the bottom, a sealed envelope with her name written on it in her father's distinctive handwriting. What is it? Mason asked, noting her sudden stillness. A letter, Beatrice murmured. For me, but I never saw it before. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. Her father's familiar script filled the paper, and she began to read aloud. My dearest Beatrice, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found yourself in circumstances that have led you to question your past. I have dreaded this day, knowing that the truth I have kept from you would eventually come to light, yet hoping against hope that it might remain buried. You were not born alone, my darling girl. You entered this world with a twin sister, identical in every physical aspect but different in ways that became apparent all too soon. Your mother and I named you Beatrice and Belinda, after characters in a poem we both loved. Your mother's death when you were 3 was not from consumption, as I led you to believe. She took her own life after a long struggle with melancholia, triggered in part by the difficulties of raising two children who were growing increasingly different in temperament. Belinda, even as a small child, showed troubling signs: cruelty to animals, deceitfulness, a complete lack of empathy that no amount of discipline or guidance seemed to affect. After your mother's death, I tried to raise you both, but Belinda's behavior worsened. When she was 12, she set fire to a neighbor's barn, nearly killing their child who was playing inside. It was then that I made the heartbreaking decision to send her to a special school for troubled girls in Boston. You were told she was a cousin going to boarding school, and you eventually stopped asking about her. For years, I received reports of her progress or lack thereof. When she was 18, she ran away from the school, and I lost track of her entirely. I've kept this secret to protect you, Beatrice. Not from your sister, but from the pain of knowing that your twin, your other half, was so fundamentally different from you. I feared that knowledge might make you question your own nature, might cast a shadow over your kind and generous spirit. If circumstances have brought this letter to your attention, then I can only assume that Belinda has reappeared in your life in some capacity. Be wary, my daughter. Your sister is intelligent and cunning, and she harbors a deep resentment toward me and, by extension, possibly toward you as well. Know that you were always the light of my life, Beatrice. Your goodness and compassion were my salvation in dark times. Whatever you learn about your sister, remember that you are your own person, defined by your choices and your heart, not by the accident of shared birth. With eternal love, your father. Silence fell as Beatrice finished reading. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away, her mind struggling to absorb the revelations in her father's letter. I had a sister all along, she whispered finally. A twin. And my father kept her existence from me to protect me. Mason sat beside her on the edge of the bed, his presence a solid comfort. He did what he thought was best, he said gently. From what he describes, your sister was troubled from an early age. And now she's wanted for murder, Beatrice said, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. And the Farley Gang is after her after me because they think I have something she stole. This changes things, Marshal Hollister said, pacing the small room. If Belinda Calloway has been using your identity, she could be anywhere, doing anything in your name, including accepting a teaching position at Denver Ladies' Academy, Beatrice realized with sudden clarity. The position I was traveling to take. What if Belinda arranged it? What if she's been laying a trail for me to follow? Mason frowned, considering this. It's possible. If she knew you were in Cottonwood Springs, she might have engineered a reason for you to come to Denver. But why? Beatrice asked, bewildered. What could she possibly want from me after all these years? Perhaps she needs a scapegoat, Hollister suggested grimly. Someone to take the fall for Hamilton's murder while she disappears with the deed to the Silver Queen mine. Or perhaps she genuinely wants to reconnect with her twin, Melanie offered, her expression sympathetic. Family is family, after all. Beatrice shook her head, remembering her father's warnings. No, I don't think so. If my father's letter is accurate, Belinda is not someone who acts out of familial sentiment. We need to draw her out, Mason decided. And the best way to do that is to give her what she wants. Me, Beatrice said with sudden understanding. You want to use me as bait? Mason's expression hardened. Absolutely not. I was thinking more along the lines of spreading word that we've recovered the deed to the Silver Queen mine. If Belinda is monitoring communications to or from Cottonwood Springs, that might flush her out. Or it might bring the Farley Gang down on us again in full force, Hollister countered. We barely held them off last time. I have a better idea, Beatrice said, her mind working rapidly. What if I continue to Denver as planned? Take the teaching position as if I know nothing about Belinda or the deed. Out of the question, Mason said immediately. It's too dangerous. Hear me out, Beatrice insisted. Belinda arranged this position for a reason. She's expecting me in Denver. If I don't show up, she'll know something's wrong. But if I do go with adequate protection, she nodded to Hollister, we might be able to catch her when she makes contact. Hollister stroked his mustache thoughtfully. It could work. We could put together a team of marshals, keep you under surveillance at all times. No, Mason said again, more forcefully. It's too risky. Beatrice would be exposed, vulnerable. I'm not some delicate flower, Mason, Beatrice argued. I've proven I can handle myself. Against one outlaw in an alley, yes. Not against your potentially murderous twin sister and a gang of ruthless bandits. Mason's expression was unyielding. Why not get a say in this? Beatrice demanded, rising to her feet. This is my life, my sister, my decision. And it's my job to protect this town and everyone in it, Mason countered, standing as well. Including you, whether you want that protection or not. The tension between them was palpable. Hollister cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should discuss this further after everyone's had a chance to calm down and consider all options, he suggested diplomatically. Melanie nodded agreement. It's been a shocking day for all of us, especially Beatrice. Let's not make any hasty decisions. Mason's jaw worked as he visibly reined in his emotions. Fine. We'll reconvene in the morning. In the meantime, Beatrice stays here at the hotel under guard. I'm not a prisoner, Marshal, Beatrice said coldly, deliberately using his title rather than his name. No, you're not, he agreed, his voice softening slightly. You're someone I'm trying to keep alive, Miss Calloway. With that, he strode from the room, his spurs jingling with each angry step. Hollister gave Beatrice an apologetic nod before following, leaving her alone with Melanie. He cares for you, Melanie said quietly once the men had gone. More than he's cared for anyone in a very long time. The thought of you putting yourself in danger terrifies him. That doesn't give him the right to make decisions for me, Beatrice replied, though some of the anger had drained from her voice. No, it doesn't, Melanie agreed. But try to understand his perspective. Mason has lost people before our parents, colleagues in the line of duty. It's made him protective of those he values. The hesitation before the final word was slight but noticeable. Beatrice glanced sharply at Melanie, who offered a small, knowing smile. Rest, Melanie advised, heading for the door. Things often look clearer after a good night's sleep. But sleep proved elusive once again. Beatrice lay awake for hours, her mind churning with revelations about her past and questions about her future. The existence of a twin sister, a potentially dangerous one at that, had upended everything she thought she knew about herself and her family. And then there was Mason. His fierce protectiveness both frustrated and touched her. In the span of just a few days, he had become someone whose opinion mattered to her, whose presence she found herself seeking. The intensity of these feelings for a man she barely knew was disconcerting, yet undeniable. Dawn found her at the window, watching as the town slowly came to life. The damage from the Farley Gang's attack was still evident, but the resilient spirit of the frontier was equally apparent in the way people were already rebuilding, moving forward. A knock at her door announced Melanie, bringing coffee and fresh biscuits. Mason's waiting downstairs, she said. He's been up all night by the looks of him, working on some plan or other. Beatrice dressed quickly and made her way to the hotel's small dining room, where Mason sat alone at a table, papers spread before him, his expression intent. He looked up as she entered, and the warmth that flooded his tired eyes at the sight of her made Beatrice's heart skip a beat. "Good morning," she said, taking the seat across from him. "Melanie says you've been working on a plan. I have, he confirmed, gathering the papers into a neat stack. Several actually, none of which involve you traveling to Denver as bait, Beatrice sighed. Mason, hear me out, he interrupted gently. Please. She nodded, willing to listen. I've been thinking about what your sister might want from you, he began. If she arranged the teaching position to lure you to Denver, it wasn't just to frame you for Hamilton's murder. The Denver police already suspect her. Your appearance wouldn't change that. So what then? Beatrice asked. I think she needs something from you, something only you would have. Mason tapped the table thoughtfully. Your father's papers, perhaps? Beatrice considered this. There's nothing of value in his papers, just personal correspondence, academic writings, his will. Your father was a professor of literature, correct? Mason asked. Yes, specializing in Shakespeare and the Romantic poets. And in his letter, he mentioned naming you and your sister after characters in a poem they both loved. Mason leaned forward intently. What poem was that? Beatrice's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Shelley's The Witch of Atlas. There's a line about twin sisters named Beatrice and Belinda. Is there anything significant about that poem? Anything that could be interpreted as a code or a hidden message? Not that I'm aware of, Beatrice replied slowly, but my father was fond of puzzles and wordplay. He often incorporated them into his lectures to keep students engaged. Mason nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd been considering. I think the deed to the Silver Queen mine might be hidden in your father's papers, possibly encoded within something related to that poem. But why would my father have a deed to a Colorado silver mine? Beatrice asked, bewildered. I don't know, Mason admitted. But it would explain why Belinda might be trying to lure you to Denver. She knows it's among your father's things, but she doesn't know exactly where or how to decode it. Beatrice sat back, her mind racing. If you're right, then the deed is here in Cottonwood Springs, not in Denver. It's been with me all along. Which means we don't need to send you to Denver, Mason concluded with satisfaction. We can search your father's papers here, find the deed, and use it to lure both Belinda and the Farley Gang into a trap. Assuming it exists at all, Beatrice cautioned. This is still speculation. It's the best theory we have, Mason insisted. And it doesn't require putting you in unnecessary danger. Before Beatrice could respond, the hotel door burst open, admitting a breathless deputy. Marshal, telegraph from Fort Collins. Army patrols spotted the Farley Gang camped in the hills about 15 miles east. They're gearing up for something big, at least 20 men. Mason was on his feet instantly. When? Message says they look ready to move today or tomorrow at the latest. They're coming back for another attempt on the town, Mason realized grimly, and this time in force. He turned to Beatrice. We need to find that deed, and quickly. It may be our only leverage. For the next several hours, Beatrice pored over her father's papers, searching for any reference to the Silver Queen mine or any coded messages that might indicate the location of a deed. Mason organized the town's defenses, positioning men at strategic points and evacuating women and children to the church, which had been designated as a shelter due to its stone construction. By mid-afternoon, Beatrice had found nothing conclusive, though several passages in her father's personal journal hinted at a valuable asset he was holding in trust. There were also multiple references to the poem The Witch of Atlas, with certain lines underlined or annotated in ways that seemed significant but remained opaque to her. Maybe we're approaching this wrong, she said to Mason when he checked on her progress. If my father hid something in code, he would have ensured I could find it if necessary. He would have left clues that would make sense to me specifically. What would be significant to you? Mason asked. Something from your childhood, perhaps. Beatrice's gaze fell on a small, leather-bound volume of poetry among her father's books. "Shelley's collected works," she murmured, reaching for it. "He gave me this edition on my 16th birthday." The book fell open naturally to The Witch of Atlas, the pages worn from frequent reading. As Beatrice scanned the familiar verses, she noticed small, nearly invisible dots beneath certain letters. Someone her father, presumably, had marked them so faintly that they would be noticeable only to someone looking closely. "Mason, look at this," she said excitedly. "These marks, they form a pattern." Together, they worked to identify all the marked letters, writing them down in sequence. Slowly, a message emerged. "Behind Portrait Mother Library binding 3rd folio." It's instructions, Mason realized. But what portrait? What library? "The portrait of my mother that hung in my father's study," Beatrice said, her mind racing. "And his collection of Shakespeare's folios. He had a complete set. They were his pride and joy." "But those would be back in Pennsylvania, wouldn't they?" Beatrice shook her head slowly. "No. I sold most of his books to pay debts, but I couldn't bear to part with the folios. They're in storage with a bookseller in Denver, Mr. Harrington, on Lawrence Street. I planned to retrieve them once I was settled in my teaching position." Mason's eyes lit with understanding. "That's it. The deed must be hidden within or behind the binding of the 3rd folio. Belinda must have figured this out and arranged for you to come to Denver so you could lead her to it." "But how would she know about the folios at all?" Beatrice wondered. "If my father sent her away when she was 12. "Perhaps she kept track of your family over the years," Mason suggested. "Or maybe your father mentioned them in correspondence with the school where she was sent." Before they could discuss it further, gunfire erupted from the edge of town. Mason was on his feet instantly, drawing his pistol. "They're here," he said grimly. "Earlier than expected. Stay here, Beatrice. This room has no windows and only one entrance. It's as safe as anywhere in town right now." "Be careful," she urged, gripping his arm as he turned to leave. He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, might even kiss her. Instead, he simply nodded and strode from the room, locking the door behind him. Alone, Beatrice could only listen to the sounds of battle erupting around the town. Gunshots, shouts, the occasional crash or explosion. The Farley Gang had come in force, just as the army patrol had warned. She paced the small room anxiously, wishing there was something she could do to help. The people of Cottonwood Springs had been kind to her, had accepted her into their community. Now they were fighting, perhaps dying, because of a connection to her they hadn't even known existed until days ago. A scraping sound at the window made her freeze. The room had no windows, but it did have a small ventilation grate near the ceiling that opened to the alley behind the hotel. As Beatrice watched in horror, the grate was pried loose from outside, and a face appeared in the opening, a face identical to her own, yet utterly different in expression. "Hello, sister dear," Belinda Calloway said with a cold smile. "It's been far too long.